We gotta film this while emotions are high before I turn around and actually convince myself that this movie was okay. Now we're talking about a sequel to a movie that from a narrative perspective I thought was pretty well buttoned up. We took one of the all-time greatest comic book villains across all properties, be it DC, Marvel, Image, you name it, and we found a way to actually have him exist in a world that doesn't involve his arch nemesis yet, Batman. We follow the continuation of our faceless stranger Arthur Fleck, who across the events of the original movie makes his slow burn transformation into a version of our titular character, Joker. Failed comedian, has a little bit of a mental illness situation going on. A couple of bad days later, eventually someone just crashes out and, of course, commits the events that he does within the original movie. We'll try not to spoil this for the first one, and definitely won't try to spoil this for the second one. I'd like for you folks to go out there and watch it. However, spoiler alert, I would say save your money for when this pops up on Max. So, due to the events of Arthur's crash out, which you've either seen in the movie, you've seen through the memes at this point, thank you again for the reference in the back, the movie still ends in a decent enough spot where, of course, the bad guy gets locked away in jail and is set to just rot at the end of it. So with the events and how everything wraps up, you can walk out the theater thinking this is just a one-shot adventure, right? I have a Joker in a world where he's just crazy and he's mentally ill. Wonderful. Now there's room for argument with the pillars that the production team leverages to justify the need for a sequel here to Joker, that on one camp you can say we didn't really need this, on another camp this could have been a TV production or a TV series we could have thrown out on Max, but eventually we start to invoke the question or the concept that someone has to answer for the crimes that have been committed. Is this a duality kind of thing where based on some sort of mental illness or past trauma, we're seeing a split personality kind of bake out? Are Arthur Fleck and our Joker two separate individuals, and we have to figure out who was behind the wheel those fateful nights that happened, I think 2 years ago, as far as where the timeline was setting us? And on the other side of the coin, how poisoning, idolizing the wrong people can be for a society or a city of people like Gotham, who we always see throughout the course of media kind of two sides of the gamut fighting for the soul of Gotham, right? Are we going truth and justice, or are we going for crime, evil, and villainy throughout that entire experience? So with the pillars presented, we understand that we're in for another grounded story where we have to pull Arthur out of his jail cell and get him to answer for those crimes. I'm largely going to be sitting through what I would assume to be a courtroom drama where we start to really kind of take a bit of a further, deeper dive into who the character is and start answering for who was behind the wheel that night throughout the entire, let's say, first and second act, and then probably asking the question for Act 3, well, which is it? You got to make a choice in this perspective. And I'll admit it, they had me in the first half. We were ramping up into that courtroom drama mixed in with musical elements that the production team had warned us about well before the movie had came out, and we'll talk about that in a future segment, but I don't think it was necessarily that bad for those specific points brought in. However, throughout the runtime of the movie, I couldn't help but feel with certain elements or certain ways that scenes were shot that there definitely had to be an aspect of rewrites or some sort of reshoots that started to kind of just cloud the direction of the movie and ultimately the outcome that we may have been looking for, or maybe we were looking for all along. Which, with those jumbled elements and those weirdly shot scenes, I think contributes to why we give the Joker 5 out of 10 here on the channel if we're doing this based off the 10 scale, compared to what a lot of other folks out there are kind of doing and just kneecapping this thing at a 2 out of 10, saying, hey, I could have made a better home movie for a sequel if I really had wanted to. Now, 5 out of 10, 2 out of 10, that doesn't really make a difference. Anything below 6 out of 10 might as well just be the biggest pile of crap imaginable. Now we got the rating out of the way. Being aware of everyone's attention span, feel free to click off, like, subscribe, come back for the next review, come back for the next set of videos if you will. But if you want to stick around, there are some goods here that contribute towards why I would give this more of a 5 than a 2 out of 10 like a lot of other people are kneecapping, and I think that really kind of goes more off of the character elements itself that the production team tries to play into specifically for Joker and even Harley through that means. Starting with the goods, Act 1 and Act 2 are where this movie performs its best. We enter a world 2 years later where Arthur now will stand trial for the crimes that he's committed within the first movie and has to essentially defend himself from getting what I thought would have been the death sentence. Act 1, all about emotionally unpacking the events of the first movie. We see that there's some sort of regret or remorse within Arthur as he spends his time inside of Arkham. There's no shred of Joker anywhere near his persona. It's almost as if he's lost his mojo, essentially. The narrative then starts to swell throughout. More components are introduced that have the audience start to question, okay, what are Arthur's influences actually? We can see that he's taking even meds inside of the Arkham Institute, which may be keeping him on more of the docile side, but now he starts to meet other patients in Arkham that are largely influenced or largely enamored with the secondary persona that this movie tries to harp on, which would be the Joker persona. Seemingly, he's unaware of the impact he's had on the outside world of Gotham, and it isn't until he meets our supporting character Harley that he starts to understand that there is a cult following or a fan base of folk that love him, the idea of what he represents, and her being essentially #1 sponsor of that fan club. And through those findings, Arthur starts to slowly descend back into his Joker persona. And this is where the musical elements really start to ramp up throughout the movie. Joker gets his groove back, the world becomes a stage, and this goes one for one with how we see Joker typically handled in the comics, right? Everything has some sort of pomp and circumstance behind it. I'm just trying to make the Batman smile, etc., etc. We all know what that gamut is about. By Act 2, he's head over heels in love with Harley, who definitely contributes towards some of the bads in the movie as well, and he's gearing up for court where he'll stand on trial with his defense attorney, and they're of course going to call a couple witnesses to the stage and testify to the character of who Arthur Fleck is or who the Joker is. And again, in this act, the movie doubles down on the pillars that it sets itself up on, really, where the whole court case is about, is this a mental disorder? Is this a guy who just crashed out, for example, and we know he's going to do it again? We see that played behind the defense attorney and, of course, the prosecuting attorney, who I won't get into it for spoilers, but again, do not spend money to go see this movie. Just wait for it to come out on Max. It's cool. It's not that cool. It's not that worth spending the $20 to $30 wherever you are. And in the courtroom is where the movie shines. All the witnesses who are brought on to testify for and against Arthur really start to eat away at his preconceptions of his own reality. For example, everything that he's known to be true since he's a child, things start to get flipped on the head where there really starts to only become one answer, where Arthur is at the cliff's edge and the only option he sees is to just fully lean into who the Joker is and who the Joker makes him to be. And the transformation happening in the courtroom also does bring up one of the better musical numbers that take place throughout the movie, but then we slowly start to transition into where the bads populate, and I would like to say that they are all in Act 3, but there are a few that are scattered for how some of those hooks are actually placed out there. With regards to the bad, I think there were just too many influencers or hands in the pot of people who were influencing, let's say, Arthur's continued behavior moving forward. You of course had Harley with the larger share of impact across the people of Gotham who were idolizing Joker and of course were becoming clowns or his clown henchmen, if you will. On the other side, you had even the Arkham guards themselves who had some sort of impact in defining who Arthur was, when in reality, for the character that we had been introduced to, especially in the first movie, his backstory wasn't really that baked out. The courtroom actually goes back to cover on that backstory where there's enough meat there to chew on, or enough meat on the bone, if you will, to understand why he is the way he is without anyone impacting that any further. Meaning the fate of Arthur and the Joker persona by the conclusion of the movie, where without getting into spoilers too much, they essentially beat the Joker out of him and then he just decides, I don't want to be Joker anymore in this. And at that point is where I felt myself and the audience were a bit confused on why we were even here to begin with. This movie didn't need a sequel. With the way it ended, he's in Arkham, he's having the time of his life being crazy, but we're going to create a continuation that allows us to expand upon the character, which we do within the first act and a half, and then just rug pull immediately and say, oh well, no big deal, he's no longer who he says he is, and actually, he never even was to begin with. Without spoilers. We can talk about it with spoilers on another video if you guys want. There's always the stream, no holds barred there in terms of discussing spoilers, right? You guys can look away from the screen in that perspective. but I'm more upset that Lady Gaga could have been a really good Harley Quinn in a really good Batman universe movie with Joker in tandem, and instead had her role, or potentially, we don't know what could happen from here on out, but definitely was more kind of wasted on this imaginary Harley-like scenario that wasn't really Harley to begin with either. There was a lot of weird fairy dust that was kind of going on at the end that just didn't really wrap up the way you wanted it to. The way even some of Harley's story was crammed into the movie felt like there could have been shreds for a third movie. Some questions were raised that make you really want to kind of dive into her persona and seeing how that expands upon, but of course, I don't think we were ever really going to get a third. I feel like we really were never supposed to get a second, and we kind of just ham-fisted what we could together. Also, you know, even to a certain extent, when we think about the bads too, some of the musical elements could have been done, I guess, better. Not saying that I'd be able to shoot a musical better, but I would have liked a little bit more of that kind of deadpan-y fourth wall, for lack of better term, kind of breaking. And it does happen in certain parts of the movie where Arthur gets up and starts singing, and there's a normal, sane human being somewhere along the lines where he's like, "What are you doing? Like, stop." Like, I think if we could have played into that element just a little bit more, where the band isn't always playing for some of these musical portions, where there's not Harley and the Joker around, would have made for a little bit more, I think, kind of an engaging or interactive element. Other times, it sometimes does take away from the movie and does get a little ham-fisted. So while it's also good, there are some bad parts of a musical, but you can't blame them for trying. If there were some things that I would change to make this movie a little bit more palatable, to get us at least towards maybe 6, 7 out of 10-ish territory, in my opinion, I would look to reduce Harley Quinn's involvement. I don't think she should have been as prominent quite yet. Definitely involved in the movie as someone who eggs things on with her idolizing, but not really having that much of an impact for an already kind of cramped movie that we have to unpack the psyche of who we're focusing on, which is Arthur. If there were some things that I would change to make this movie a little bit more palatable, to get us at least towards maybe 6, 7 out of 10-ish territory, in my opinion, I would look to reduce Harley Quinn's involvement. I don't think she should have been as prominent quite yet. Definitely involved in the movie as someone who eggs things on with her idolizing, but not really having that much of an impact for an already kind of cramped movie that we have to unpack the psyche of who we're focusing on, which is Arthur. So more like Folie do personalities, not two people who are mentally ill. We're talking about split personas, right? And the movie does kind of lean into that at first, where they're like, hey, we're going to say these are two separate people, and then we kind of abandon that throughout. In a world without Batman, I think this movie could have definitely done with someone to kind of fill in that role, not pretending to be Batman, but a stoic, stern, serious-like figure that Joker kind of gets a little bit more entrenched into or infatuated with, because he was put on this world to make people smile, and we see some kind of misconception start to be brought off on that side. And ultimately, just stick the landing. We made a movie that was based off of one of the most vile, sadistic comic book villains that are out there, which we thought for the first one would be nothing but just a non-stop slaughterfest, until we actually started to learn more about the plot, and eventually experience the movie, and it really became a grounded tale. You had a chance here where you could still continue off of that and turn him into the Clown Prince of Crime, and still just kind of put the gate there and say this is still its own pocket reality. Instead, we almost seemingly scrapped that. I don't know if something was going on behind the scenes, if there were reshoots, if there was ultimately no desire to really have the first movie be that successful, so we just had to kneecap this whole thing and say, dunzo, we ain't making a third because you all gave it a 2 out of 10. Something had to have happened on the back end. I'm not one for speculation, so I'll shut up on that, but really just stick the landing. We're already here. We've already greenlit the concept. Just fucking do the damn thing. So overall, 5 out of 10. It's a good day over here, so 5.5 out of 10 realistically from the channel. Don't spend your hard-earned money on this. I know things are getting a little tight out there. We're tightening the belt where we can. Wait for it to come out on Max if you're paying for a subscription. If you're not paying for Max, then hey, wait for someone else to stream it across the street and just go watch it through your neighbor's windows, for example. As always, folks, I don't know how the comments are going to go here. I definitely kept some of the more controversial bits out of it as well, but let me know what you guys thought, if you saw it, if you're waiting for it, if you're just reading the spoilers that are out there. Like the video, right? Subscribe to the channel, of course. I'm not going to do all that begging, but I'm just going to say, hey, if you want to talk about it more live, we go live every Wednesday or every Saturday-ish, so there's always someone to at least kind of shout into the abyss for, right? I'll hear you guys out, and I'll also respond back there. My name is Final Boss Ron. I'll talk to you guys on the next one.